What if the person you want most is also the one who can destroy your life? Alexander has always had absolute control over everything. He is a ruthless, cold and methodical millionaire. Nothing escapes his grasp until she comes along. An unknown woman, an enigmatic look, and a dangerous secret that could end everything. The moment their paths cross, something inside him changes. Obsession grows. Desire becomes inevitable. But something is wrong. She shouldn't be there. No one knows where she came from. No one knows who she really is. And when Alexander discovers the truth, it's already too late. He can't go back. He can't forget her. And now his life is at risk. Love could be his downfall or his only chance of salvation. But the question is, how far is he willing to go to protect her? Get ready for an intense romance, full of mystery, twists and turns and secrets that should never have been revealed. The clock was exactly 6 o'clock when Alexander opened his eyes. He didn't need alarm clocks. His body was used to a rigid discipline that he had imposed on himself. He sat up in bed, feeling the morning freshness coming in through the large glass window, and ran his hand through his hair as he mentally reviewed his schedule. Every minute of his day was scheduled, with no room for surprises. After a warm shower and an impeccably served breakfast, Alexander put on a perfectly tailored suit and walked to the garage, where his driver was already waiting for him. "Good morning, sir. The usual route?" asked the man, opening the car door. "Yes, no detours," replied Alexander, getting into the vehicle. The way to the office was always the same. The city passed him by like an elegant blur of lights and concrete. For him, it wasn't a spectacle, just another predictable landscape in his routine. As soon as he arrived, his employees greeted him with reverence. His name was synonymous with respect, power, and efficiency. Nothing was out of his control. In the middle of the morning, while he was reviewing reports, an old friend and business partner, Richard, walked into his office unannounced. "Alexander, have you ever thought about living a little?" he asked, taking a seat on the leather sofa. Alexander looked up from his monitor. "What do you mean? You live between meetings, contracts, and investments, but when was the last time you went out for something that wasn't strictly strategic?" "I don't see the point," Alexander replied, picking up a pen and making a note on one of the papers on the table. Richard laughed and shook his head. "You're a fucking robot. You need something to get you off this pedestal you've created. And what do you suggest? That I go to bars like a teenager? Nothing too drastic. Just accept the invitation to the reception tonight. It's a social event, but it doesn't have to be all business. Maybe you'll meet someone interesting." Alexander sighed. His first reaction was to refuse, but then he remembered his mother. He could already predict her speech about the need to maintain social ties, about how his image as heir to the family needed to be reinforced. "Right, I'll go." Richard smiled victoriously. Finally, a human decision. In the evening, while adjusting his tie in front of the mirror, Alexander found himself reflecting on his friend's words. He didn't need any distractions, and he certainly wasn't interested in meeting anyone. But something inside him told him that tonight would be different. The reception was in full swing when Alexander arrived. The hall, lit by imposing chandeliers, was buzzing with conversation, and glasses of champagne were being raised in discreet toasts. He strode into the room with his usual firm posture and calculating gaze, greeting acquaintances with a slight nod. Everything about the event seemed to be a repeat of so many other evenings like it. Trained smiles, rehearsed dialogues, and hidden interests masked under false cordiality. He took a glass of wine from one of the waiters circulating around the room and positioned himself next to one of the marble columns, watching. His attention was on no one in particular, until a subtle movement on the other side of the room made his gaze fix on her. A woman. She had her back to him, wearing a simple black dress with no sparkle, no exaggeration. She wasn't wearing flashy jewelry. She didn't seem to be part of the social circle that frequented that kind of event. And yet she exuded a presence that made him frown slightly. "Interested in someone, Alexander?" Richard's voice sounded next to him. Alexander took a sip of his wine before answering. "Who is she?" Richard followed his gaze and frowned. "I have no idea. I've never seen her before." "Find out. Do you really want to know? Or do you just want a name to catalogue among the faces you won't see again?" Alexander ignored his friend's provocative tone. He rarely took an interest in anyone at events like this, but there was something different about this woman, something that made him want to observe her a little more. When she finally turned around, their gazes met. For a second, the hall around them seemed to lose its sound. There was something in her eyes, not just beauty, but depth, a flame that challenged him. She didn't look away. Alexander raised his glass slightly in an almost imperceptible gesture, a silent greeting. She just smiled sideways without changing her expression, and then walked off in the opposite direction, disappearing among the guests. Richard let out a low whistle. Well, that was unexpected. Alexander didn't reply. He just swirled the wine around in his glass, observing the dark surface of the liquid. Something told him that this wouldn't be the last time he'd see her. Alexander wasn't usually distracted, but that night, after the event, he couldn't get the image of that woman out of his head. There was something about her, a mystery, a striking presence that made him want to know more. He didn't like wasting time with the unknown, but this time he was willing to make an exception. The next morning, while reviewing reports in his office, his mind still wandered to the scene from the night before. Who was she? Why didn't anyone seem to know her? His irritation grew as he realized that this doubt was bothering him more than it should. Richard entered without knocking, as usual, bringing with him his carefree air. "Still thinking about her?" he asked, throwing himself into an armchair. Alexander didn't answer immediately. He closed the folder in front of him and faced his friend. "Did you get any information?" "Some. Her name is Eliza. No known connection to the traditional families. And it seems no one knows exactly how she got into that party. That was intriguing. Those events were strictly controlled. No stranger just appeared there. Where can I find her?" "That, my dear, you'll have to find out for yourself." Richard smiled, pleased to see Alexander truly interested in something that didn't involve numbers or investments. However, he wouldn't have to look for long. That same evening, when he arrived at a high-end restaurant for a business dinner, he spotted Eliza sitting alone at a table in the corner. This time, he didn't hesitate. He approached and stopped in front of her. "It seems we've met again," he said casually. She raised her eyes and for a brief moment studied him curiously. Then she smiled slightly. "I'd say fate has an interesting sense of humor." He pulled out a chair and sat down without asking permission. "Or maybe it's just statistics. Paths cross when you're in the same circle. But we're not in the same circle, are we?" She tilted her head slightly, challenging him. He liked the boldness. "No, we're not." "So what exactly do you want, Alexander?" It was rare for someone to call him by name so directly, without reverence or obvious interest. It made him smile in a way that even he didn't realize. "To know who you are." She laughed softly, bringing the glass of wine to her lips. "Some mysteries are more interesting when they remain unanswered." He didn't know why, but that sentence only increased his desire to find out everything about her. Alexander had never been a patient man, but that night, after his encounter with Eliza, he realized that curiosity was slowly turning into something deeper. He didn't like mysteries. He liked answers, and Eliza was an enigma he wanted to decipher. The next day, sitting behind his imposing mahogany desk, he called his assistant. "I want as much information about Eliza as possible," he ordered, without taking his eyes off the papers in front of him. The assistant nodded, but hesitated before leaving. "Is there a problem?" Alexander looked up. "Sir, there are no significant records on her, no known family history, no registered property. It's as if she just appeared out of nowhere." This made Alexander frown. How could someone who frequented high society events leave no trace? That night, he decided to look for Eliza again. He didn't believe in coincidences, but fate seemed to be playing tricks on him. He found her in a sophisticated bar, sitting at the counter, blending effortlessly into the crowd. He walked over and sat down next to her without saying a word. She didn't seem surprised. "You really want to know who I am, don't you?" she said, turning the glass in her hands. "I do." "Oh, what if you don't like the answer?" "I'll decide that after I know." Eliza watched him for a moment, her eyes assessing every detail of his expression. Then she leaned slightly towards him. "Some questions bring more problems than answers, Alexander. Are you sure you want to continue?" "Always." She smiled, but there was something dark in that gesture. "Then come with me." Without waiting, she got up and left the bar. Alexander hesitated for a second, but then followed. They walked in silence through the brightly lit streets until Eliza stopped in front of an old building. With a discreet gesture, she opened the door and entered, indicating that he should do the same. Inside, the room was simple, almost empty, except for a few stacked boxes. Alexander noticed a peculiar detail. There were no photos or personal belongings. "Is this your apartment?" he asked. "For now," she replied, closing the door behind him. Alexander realized that despite her natural elegance, there was something clandestine about her life. He was about to ask more, but was interrupted by the ringing of his cell phone. When he answered, an unfamiliar voice whispered on the other end of the line, "Get away from her before it's too late." Alexander froze. When he looked up, Eliza was watching him intently. "Is something wrong?" she asked, as if she already knew the answer. He disconnected the call, putting the phone back in his pocket. Nothing that can't be solved, but for the first time in a long time, Alexander wasn't sure that this was true. Alexander had never been a man to be intimidated. However, as he watched Eliza in that almost empty room, with the echo of the threat still resonating in his mind, he realized that he was entering uncharted territory. She tilted her head slightly, studying his expression. "You look different now," she commented, crossing her arms. He kept his posture firm. "I received an interesting call." Eliza didn't react immediately. Then, with a subtle sigh, she turned and walked to the window. "I thought this would happen." Alexander approached. "Who made that call?" She remained silent for a few moments, staring at the city lights. When she finally turned to him, her eyes held something between weariness and determination. "I warned you that some answers bring more problems than solutions." He refused to back down. "That's not an answer." Eliza let out a small, humorless laugh. "You really don't give up, do you?" "Not when something interests me." She watched him for a moment, then picked up a coat and slung it over her shoulders. "Come on, if you want to know the truth, you need to see it for yourself." Without waiting for his reply, she left the apartment, walking down the stairs with determined steps. Alexander hesitated for a second. He knew he was crossing a line by following her, but at that point, turning back was no longer an option. The two of them walked in silence through the streets until they reached a discreet restaurant, away from the busy areas of the city. Eliza entered without hesitation, and he followed her. Inside, a man with a watchful eye looked up when he saw them. He seemed prepared for anything. "Have you brought company?" he asked in a low, suspicious voice. "He needs to understand," Eliza replied firmly. Alexander noticed the tension in the air. Before he could speak, the man pushed an envelope to the center of the table. "This is what he needs to know." Alexander took the envelope and opened it. Inside, he found photo images of Eliza in different locations, always looking like she was being watched. In some, she wasn't alone, and in one of them, in the background, there was a man he didn't recognize, but who seemed to be watching her from afar. He looked at Eliza. "Who is that?" She took a deep breath. "The reason I can't get involved with you." Alexander slowly closed the envelope. Too late for that. Eliza's gaze wavered for a moment, but before she could answer, a waiter discreetly approached and whispered something in the ear of the man in front of them. He stood up immediately. We need to leave. Now. Alexander didn't need to ask why. He already knew that, whatever the danger, it was closer than he had imagined. The air inside the restaurant seemed to get heavier. Alexander saw the man's eyes harden, his posture stiffen. Eliza didn't hesitate. She stood up immediately, taking Alexander by the arm. No questions asked. No questions asked. He didn't like being commanded, but at that moment, something in her tone didn't allow for discussion. They left through the side door, cutting through a narrow alleyway that led to a side street. The man accompanying them kept a quick pace ahead. "Did anyone follow us?" Eliza asked. He nodded discreetly. "3 cars have been parked on the corner since we entered. It's probably not a coincidence." Alexander, who was used to situations of absolute control, felt uncomfortable with the unpredictability of the moment. "Who exactly are we avoiding?" he asked, his patience wearing thin. Eliza stopped and turned to him, her eyes intense. "The man from the photos." Alexander crossed his arms. "And who is he?" She took a deep breath as if she knew this moment would come. "He used to be someone very important to me, but now he's a problem." "Someone dangerous?" The man next to them laughed briefly. "You have no idea." Eliza gave her partner a warning look, then turned to Alexander. "I needed to disappear, and then you came into my life. It wasn't planned, but now it's happened," he said, his tone unchanged. She lowered her eyes for a moment before nodding. "Yes." The 3 of them made their way to a discreet car parked in a less well-lit area. The driver, a man Alexander had never seen before, was ready. "You 2 need to get out of town for a while," said Eliza's escort, looking directly at Alexander. "And why would I run away?" he retorted defiantly. "Because from the moment you got involved with her, you became a target too." Alexander considered those words for a moment. He could simply walk away, ignore it all and go back to his structured life, but something inside him refused to take that step back. "Are you coming with me?" asked Eliza. She held his gaze for a moment before murmuring, "Yes." Alexander nodded slowly and got into the car. If he was going to plunge into the unknown, let it be with her by his side. The road slid under the wheels of the car like an endless line of darkness and faint lights. The silence inside the vehicle was dense, filled with unspoken thoughts. Eliza stared out of the window, her expression indecipherable. Alexander beside her studied her discreetly, trying to find answers in the way her fingers touched the glass, in the way her shoulders seemed more tense than before. "How long are we going to be away?" he asked, breaking the silence. Eliza was slow to answer. "Long enough for him to lose track of us." "And then what?" She closed her eyes for a moment before turning to him. "Then I'm leaving for good." There was a weight to her words that Alexander didn't like. "You mean you intend to disappear?" She didn't confirm or deny it. She just looked at him in a way that made something inside him tighten. The car drove for hours until they stopped at a discreet hotel on the edge of town. The driver handed Eliza the room key and left without saying a word. In the room, a small but comfortable space, Alexander sat in an armchair while Eliza leaned against the chest of drawers. The moment they had both been putting off had finally arrived. "Tell me the truth," he asked, his voice calm but firm. Eliza crossed her arms. "I've said enough. Enough to leave me with more questions than answers." She sighed and walked over to the bed, sitting down. "Do you want to know why he's after me?" Alexander just nodded. "Because I'm the only person who can destroy him." The words hung in the air between them. "Who is he?" She ran her tongue over her lips before answering. "A man who has enough power to control people like chess pieces, who can make those who become a problem disappear." Alexander leaned forward. "And what did you do to become a problem for him?" Eliza stared at him for a long moment before finally saying, "I found out things that he would never let anyone else find out." The silence returned, heavier than before. "And do you really think running away will be enough?" Alexander asked. She cracked a small smile, but there was no humor in it. "No, but I'm not running." I'm waiting for the right moment to attack you first. Alexander felt a shiver run down his spine. For the first time, he realized that Eliza wasn't just a woman on the run. She was a woman at war. And now, he was in the middle of it. The night progressed slowly, and Alexander couldn't sleep. Eliza's words echoed in his mind. I'm not running. I'm waiting for the right moment to attack you first. He didn't know if that worried him or fascinated him. The muffled sound of a cell phone vibrating broke the silence in the room. Alexander saw Eliza quickly pick up the device and answer without saying anything. He watched the tension in her expression as she listened to the voice on the other end of the line. Got it, she murmured before hanging up. Alexander got up from his chair. What's wrong? She took a deep breath before answering. He found us. Her body stiffened. What? He always does, she said, picking up her bag and quickly checking its contents. But this time, I'm ready. What exactly do you intend to do, Eliza? She stopped and looked directly at him. Put an end to it. Before he could question her, there was a sound from the corridor. Footsteps. Lots of them. Alexander moved instinctively, grabbing Eliza by the wrist and pulling her away from the door. Through the balcony, she whispered. They moved quickly. The room was on the second floor, but the fall wouldn't be fatal. Eliza climbed first, holding onto the awning below to cushion her descent. Alexander followed, falling beside her. Lights appeared in the window of the room above them. Run! Someone shouted from above. Eliza grabbed Alexander's hand and shot towards the street, cutting through the parking lot. Behind them, the sound of doors opening and hurried footsteps echoed in the night. A black car was waiting for them on the corner. The same man who had helped them earlier was at the wheel. Get in, he shouted. They threw themselves into the car. The engine roared, and the vehicle took off, swerving sharply onto the main avenue. They're following us, warned the driver. Alexander looked in the rearview mirror and saw the headlights rapidly approaching. What the hell is going on, Eliza? He demanded. She opened her handbag and took out a small USB stick. This, she said, holding it between her fingers. The proof that can destroy him. Alexander stared at the object, feeling the adrenaline rush through his body. Then let's get it over with. Eliza nodded, and for a moment a glint of determination crossed her gaze. The chase continued. But now it was no longer about escape. It was about fighting. The city flashed by in blurry flashes as the car sped through the dark streets. Alexander felt the adrenaline pulsing, but his mind remained sharp. The headlights of the pursuers were still close, and he knew they didn't have much time. Eliza clutched the small USB stick in her hand, as if she held her own destiny there. What exactly is on this device? He asked, his voice firm. She didn't look away from the road ahead. Evidence of financial crimes, illegal connections, money laundering, enough to bring him down. Alexander took a deep breath. And how did you manage that? She hesitated before answering. I was once part of that world, before I realized what was really going on. Alexander processed the information. She wasn't just a victim. She was someone who knew the game well, but had chosen to leave it. The driver made a sharp turn, trying to throw off his pursuers. Where do we deliver this? Alexander asked. Eliza pulled out a disposable cell phone and quickly typed in a number. There's an investigative journalist waiting. She's our only chance. The car sped towards the meeting point, but the pursuers wouldn't give up. One of the vehicles behind them tried to overtake them, throwing them against the curb. Hold on, shouted the driver. The car slid, almost losing control, but Alexander managed to hold on. He turned to Eliza. If we have to fight, are you ready? She held his gaze. I always have been. The driver abruptly pulled into an alley where another vehicle was waiting. A man got out of the car and waved at them. Now! Eliza shouted. Alexander opened the door and pulled Eliza in with him. They ran to the other car as the pursuers braked at the entrance to the alley. Gunshots echoed in the night. Get down! Alexander pulled Eliza behind the vehicle. The man waiting for them pulled out a gun and fired back, covering their escape. Let's go! There's no more time, he shouted. They got into the new car and drove off. The streets were left behind, as were the men hunting them. The drop-off point was nearby. When they arrived, a woman was waiting for them. "Do you have the material?" she asked. Eliza handed over the flash drive. "Everything is here." The woman nodded. "You've made the right choice. This could change everything." Alexander looked at Eliza. For the first time, she seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. "Is it over?" he asked. She held his hand. "It's just beginning."